everybody. I'm Hannah Charlton, and I'm going to be doing a craft demo on Illuminated Manuscripts. So I'm going to be showing my process step by step and working on a little miniature for the hour. So I hope you're excited to see some gold and colors. I think it will be lots of good fun, and that we'll get to learn about different materials. All right. So I'm going to switch my cameras to show materials then. Going over to this. Yes. So all of my pieces will start on graph paper. So that's what allows me to do all of the geometry and make sure all the layouts are just so. I can even cut up the graph paper and sort of assemble a piece that way to make like a complicated battle scene or a scene that has like some buildings and some people. I can just assemble that on the graph paper. And once that design is completely finished, I then put the parchment on top of that. And because the parchment is slightly translucent, I'll be able to trace directly on. So the traditional method, and I'll be doing this a lot, talking about traditional materials and what I use instead. The traditional material is parchment, which is made from animal skin. So it's a fantastic material to paint on in that it's really, really tough and lasts forever, which is why we still have a lot of manuscripts still today that have survived for hundreds of years. But as you can see, there are sometimes differences in transparency. If the animal was ever bitten by a bug, that will get stretched to a giant hole. And of course, there's going to be one side that had the hair and one side that was on the inside of the animal. So you'll get a lot of subtle little differences, thickness and transparency and greasiness. So it can be a really good material, but for the most part, it's a bit of work. So I use a vegan parchment that you can buy from stationery stores. The brand name is Pergaminata. It's a lot, but it's a fantastic material. It has a lot of that same toughness. And best of all, if you make a mistake, you can just scrape it off with a little razor blade. So I have an old woman with a dragon. And so while I'm working on this, I'm going to be explaining all the steps. And I am on the Discord checking on Irie B. So if you have any questions or want to say anything, just pop in there and I'll get to see it and say hi. All right. So once the underdrawing is all finished and the parchment is laid on top, I usually start with just microns, which are, of course, really convenient to use and not too expensive, but they do get used up very, very quickly. So all of my work is on this parchment. And my major style influence is the Morgan Crusader Bible, which you can view online. And you can, in fact, download screenshots. And so I printed out a few that I'll use as a reference, especially for really cool stylized drapery and certain details like the chainmail, which is just a series of tiny, tiny curves that are just stacked together to give the effect. So for this woman, it's an original image, but I use the Crusader Bible for the fantastic stylized drapery. I do think one of the reasons I got into medieval art was how much I liked that really sharp angled geometric drapery. It's one of the most frustrating things to draw in real life, but if you get to stylize it a bit, it turns out really, really fun. It turns into a wacky little logic puzzle. This fold is here. What do I need to do to make sure that it is a continuous piece of fabric? Because fabric really does so many incredible things. They're very hard to keep track of. Another reason I'm glad to work in illumination and not in animation. Oh my goodness, it seems so difficult. The thing I always leave for last is the face, because that has a lot of detail that gets worn down by just the hand. Just my hand rubbing on everything. I do follow the rough steps for illumination in that I start with the layout in the form of the graph paper underdrawing, and then I put on the first layer of ink. And the next thing I do is the golds. And so while gold, of course, isn't required for an illuminated manuscript, it is the one step that I think really brings the piece to life. And for this cute little dragon, I am going to give him little feather wings. Dragons with feather wings are my favorite. I think they're so cute. And I'm going to very quickly check on my reference underdrawing under here, just so I can make sure I'm tracing everything correctly. People sometimes ask how long it takes for me to complete a page. My record is 1 day, but for like a huge 9 by 12 piece, but I really don't recommend it because this is really incredibly hard on your hands and your eyes. So I do always work in shifts and I take lots of breaks. So there she is, holding the little dragon friend. And so I'll put in the outlines of the hair and the face, but I'll be going in to complete those later on in the process. Indeed. Very good. So is there a big difference? Oh, the Phantom asks, is there a big difference in feel of working on parchment versus paper? For me, there really is. This parchment is, I think, slightly more smooth than a lot of paper. The other things I work on are like Bristol board, which does have a little bit of roughness. So it's a bit smoother, and in fact, I usually have to prepare the surface with an eraser to make it just a little bit rough enough to take the ink properly. Otherwise, it is a little bit slick. The other big difference is like the thickness. Like you can hear it's really snappy and really thick and tough, and it won't fray or tear like paper does. And if I realize I'm not very happy with something, like, oh, I don't like how I kind of gave her a part where I don't really want it, I can go in with an X-Acto knife that I keep in an old wine cork, and I can just scrape it off. So it's not quite the same as an undo button, since now any gouache or ink that I put on here is going to have to go over all that roughness I just put in. It does just take away where the ink was. That's one of the reasons why when you see images of monks or other scribes writing and working, they'll always have a pen in one hand and a knife in the other. The knife is basically their eraser. So in a way, you do get to erase the ink. Right. So with the under ink drawing done, I'm going to do the next step, which is the gold. So from this step, I'm basically doing the riskiest things first. And the gold is where I'm most likely to make a mistake. And I use the gold ink with a clock on it. I don't use gold leaf, unfortunately. It is something I want to eventually try, but I like using the gold ink partly because it's just really shimmery and fun. You can just about see it sparkling there. And it allows me to then take prints of all of the pieces and paint the gold back in. Because I do want my pieces to be more accessible than actual illuminated manuscripts were. But I also want people to be able to hold them and see the shiny gold and really get to have a piece of the past. The gold step is the most fun in that it's the really shimmery step. Another reason to work with the gold ink is it's just little bits of metal. It's not even really gold. It's treated bronze. But when you get to put it on, it sparkles and shines. It's just little bits that are suspended in the liquid. So I do warn you though, if you do get this brand of ink, one of the big problems people always have is with the cap sticking. If I'm not using it every single day, I have to set it in under the bathroom sink for a few minutes under a stream of hot water just to loosen it up again. Hey, good. Anna asks, how did you get into doing illuminated manuscripts? Well, I thought that they were really, really beautiful when I like first of all learned the word illuminated manuscripts. And so I looked at a few examples and a few letters and thought they were very beautiful. And I decided to try copying them. And once I got some gold ink and was able to put it in my sketchbook, it was this moment of realizing, oh my gosh, I did it. It was like pulling a magic trick where I was able to summon this piece of the past into existence. And especially where I live in Washington State, we don't have a lot of manuscripts that you can go and see. And so for me, the only way to really see a manuscript, let alone hold one, was to make it myself. And it wasn't like any other art form I had done before. Like I had struggled sometimes with like Western perspective and anatomy and light and shadow. And all of a sudden, none of those things mattered as much. I got to take this really stylized approach that was still really beautiful and really fun. I also got into Game of Thrones around the same time. And I was really interested in how the characters in that book would have written about and how they would have painted themselves. Because I was really into fantasy art, but when I was trying to figure out how to draw an accurate, historically accurate queen or knight, all of the primary documents are generally in manuscripts, and those can be kind of hard to parse and hard to turn in to like digital art and like anatomically correct art. And I started to have a lot more fun just copying the manuscripts. I am on social media. So I am on Instagram as Hannah Charlton Arts. Make sure you have the S there. There is another Hannah Charlton who is in Yorkshire, and she's also a fantastic artist. But I'm Hannah Charlton Arts with an S. And I try to post a lot of my work as it's in progress, so you get to see all the stages and see what I'm working on. I'll pop that in the chat very quickly. And Instagram has been a fantastic resource for me since that was where I learned that there were other people that were doing this. I'm, in some ways, I'm self-taught. I was able to take courses on calligraphy and medieval art and stained glass, but it was mostly through social media that I learned that, oh, there are other illuminators, other people working with gouache and golds on parchment. I'm following a few artists who do specifically Islamic illumination. So, oh, thank you, Mini Fandom. Yes, that is me. So they do a ton of absolutely gorgeous sacred geometry. And yes, that is me. And the little icon there is of an attack on the Castle of Love, which is a pretty common medieval motif where all of these knights are attacking a castle and the women are defending the castle by throwing roses. And they're throwing the roses very, very violently. And all of these knights are being knocked over by these terrible barrages of roses just raining down. Ah, so why do I use gouache as opposed to other paints? So gouache is an opaque watercolor, basically. So it's pretty easy to get into. I'm able to customize my palette. I mix up all of my colors ahead of time. And then, so if I'm doing a big project that's going to have like a lot of a specific gray, I can mix it up and let it dry. And then I just have a quantity of paint ready to go. So it's pretty easy to use. It gives a similar feel to historical manuscripts, which would have used like temperas and again gold leaf. So it looks similar, but it's a lot easier to use. And I like using it for workshops as well, since again, I can mix up all the colors ahead of time and it's pretty straightforward. But there are other illuminators who make their own paints and even use historically accurate pigments, which if you were able to attend the presentation on illuminated manuscripts and got to hear me wax about the color blue. Historically, paints were extremely expensive since paints are really difficult to make using natural materials. All of the best colors come from semi-precious stones, so things like lapis and dragon's blood, which unfortunately we don't have. But other artists are able to actually gather those materials and make their own paints. And it is absolutely incredible. So again, I would like to learn how to do that someday. I do think the gouache is nice and approachable and not too expensive. Thank you, Steph. That was a great question. I've been seeing a lot of artists working in gouache, which I'm glad to see. I think it's a really, really fun material to work in, and it's pretty forgiving. However, I do warn everybody who's using gouache on the pergaminata here, this specific parchment. Once you get this material wet, it will start to curl. So this was a sketch I did of the personification of justice from the book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan. So it was fun. I got to test all the colors, but you can see as soon as it dried, it curled up. So this will happen to all of your pieces. So whenever I do a workshop, I give people some plastic sleeves, the backing board, and say, make sure you cover this up and keep it flat because it will want to curl. And I once had a piece that I had worked on for a week and I finally finished it late at night and I took it off the table and went to bed. And the next morning I went to my desk and the piece had disappeared. It was not on the desk. And I found out that overnight, as it dried, it had curled up into a tight little roll and rolled right off the desk. So it was on the floor. Luckily, it was safe. But yes, it's as soon as you get this wet, especially with the gouache, it will decide that it wants to be round and just roll around. All right. So you can see that up here, the gouache has more or less dried, so it's taken on a nice flat color, all the same. That will depend a lot on the brand of gouache you use and the makeup of their paint. This is the M-Gram Cobalt Blue, which is my favorite, and it's, I think, the easiest to use. It does go on pretty easily, and it does dry into a nice opaque uniform surface. The other kinds of blue, even by M-Gram, I found that when I use them, they will dry really nicely, but they don't have the same uniform texture. Like some, it'll be a bit streakier, there'll be some darker spots. Yes, the cobalt blue is lovely. It's, I think, pretty similar to the medieval ultramarine blue. It's just nice and easy to work with. And if you get the like starter set of 5 paints, they'll include this color and some other pretty easy paints to work with. It is wonderful to have people in the chat. This is the one part of the process that takes forever, and so it's the part where I'm always turning on YouTube videos just to have some human voices in the room with me. The rest of the process where I'm doing all the layouts and trying to plan everything out, I just work in complete silence. But once we're here and it's just coloring in, it's nice to have some folks around. So traditionally, a lot of this work would have been done in a scriptorium, which is the part of a monastery where everybody would be making books and making copies of books, and later on in workshops. So it would just be people illuminating and writing. So, ah, so, so Steph asks, you've lost a lot of those beautiful lines on the dress. So what do you do to bring those back out? So, yep, you can just barely see on the camera that the lines are showing up a tiny, tiny bit. So they're still there. They're just covered up. What I do as a last step, once everything's completely finished, I go over with the ink again. So again, that's why I go through the micron pen so quickly, is first I drag them all over this really weird paper-like surface, and then I make them go over dry gouache. So they just dry up immediately. I'm very, very rough on the microns. So the last step, once this is all dry, is going to be going over everything again with ink. And so you can see in other manuscripts where they would have had the underlying ink and then they went over it again with another layer of ink to just make everything snap into place. So it is really rough when, especially when I have drapery, which again, I love. And I think, oh, I have all these great lines that are going to look so good. Eventually I cover them all up and maybe I don't catch them as well over the second inking, but it's the reason I have to practice drawing drapery so much, is I can trace them, but eventually I am going to have to more or less freehand it. But one of the reasons I do the under inking is that does make a very slight impression in the surface. So even when the paint is on, there is still a slight depression that I can follow. It's one of the reasons I like working from the Morgan Bible, is it has that really graphic quality where everything has these nice heavy black outlines. It was completed around the year 1250, so it's a pretty early example. Later on, other manuscripts will be a bit more 3D, a bit more modeled, but this one is nice and flat and is more like a comic book or like stained glass with those nice heavy outlines. All right. So things like the dresses and the backgrounds and buildings are all this nice opaque color, but for like the skin and the hair, to make them stand out, I use a little wash. So like this hair might be just a little bit of brown with a bit That's blue or black to make it a little bit cooler. Maybe not that much blue. So again, Mini Phantom asks, could you put the parchment on a light board? Absolutely. I've had some students who bring in their own light boards to work from. The parchment is, again, it is translucent, but it won't, it's not as good as if I had a light box underneath. So I do think that putting it on a light box would make under drawing and under inking stand out a bit more. That would be worth a try. No, I'll add it to the things to get at the art supply store is trying out a light box. So again, this is just a very light wash. I'm going to be going over it again with the second layer of ink. But this is just to give the hair and the face just a very light bit of color. And these brushes that I'm using are just pretty cheap size 1 round brushes. So they do the job and they stand up to being used on the gold and the gouache. I don't need too much finesse for those steps. They're mostly being used to put down areas of color rather than like, put in little details. Awesome. Great question, Mini Phantom Geek Girl Joanne. That's an awesome idea. All right, so I'm going to move this back down. One thing to be careful of with the gouache is how it is water soluble. So it's one of the reasons why I keep my little water cups so small. It's because if they spill, I want it to be a bit more contained. Also, that way I don't mix up the water cups for my tea or coffee. I haven't made one of those mistakes in years, which is nice. I'm sure that people who work in physical and water-based media have, pretty sure everyone has at least once made the mistake of trying to dip your brush in water and you just dip it in your coffee. All right. I do have a lot of water cups. I have one that's just for the color, one that's just for the gold, and one that's just for the ink, so that I don't end up with like sparkly gold gouache by mistake, which is fine sometimes, but it's not a nice thing to be surprised by. You're working on a piece and suddenly something ends up sparkly that you don't want sparkly. So again, the skin tones are just a wash. For most of these pieces, every last bit of the surface will be covered with paint or that nice opaque gouache. So your eye will be able to tell that, oh, this area right here is not quite the same as everything else. And so your eye will be drawn to the areas that have that wash. And yay! All right. So now I have this really fun faceless ghost on my board. Oh, jeez, it's making me think of The Haunting of Bly Manor, but soon. Yes, so the facial features are the last thing that I do, unfortunately, because those are things that I only put down once. Like the big areas of color, I can paint over a bunch of times, but because the facial features are one going over a wash, I can only do them once. I can't scratch it off and try again. And I also want those lines to be really dark and bright. And if I do them and then start messing around with other stuff in the piece, those lines will start to wear down and they won't be as bright. Right, so I'm going to start on the final inking. This is when everything really comes together and gets nice and snappy. My tape doesn't usually give me this much trouble. Oh dear. So for the very final inking, this is when I use a miniature brush. So you can see it's so wee, it's so tiny and so lovable. And it's what gives me a really good amount of detail. Right. So to answer your question a bit more directly, Steph, I do the facial features either in very thin micron or with this brush, but I always want to do them last if I can. I recently started doing the miniature brush because I was getting tired of buying so many microns and just driving them into the ground. Was making each piece more expensive to do because each one would involve using up an entire micron just for one piece because running it over all the dried gouache and all the dried gold is using them up very quickly. Yeah, it is a little scary. It is a ton of work, and then yeah, I do the face and it's, well, I hope this one works. They say that I do the riskiest parts first, but yeah, the exception is always those faces. I do think that's one reason why legal art does tend to have like a few stock faces, a few stock expressions, is there's a little bit less risk involved in that way when you can just sort of drag and drop, like, oh, put in the angry face. We were talking in a panel on digital and physical media, how, you always end up searching for the undo button and oh, it's not there. You just have to find a way to work through it. Just part of what makes it fun. And like I mentioned in the little illumination presentation, Scribes did have a patron demon whose name was Titibolus and whose job it was to cause scribes to make a mistake. So when they were, working on copying these holy texts and suddenly they would make a mistake, that was a really big deal. And so they had a patron demon that they could blame it on. So whenever something goes wrong, you can always say, well, I guess it was Titibolus. He paid me a visit. What can I do? The fact that manuscripts were also a kind of graphic art, uh, to sort of use the modern terms, rather than a fine art like we would define it. These pieces were made to be copied and they were made to be distributed. So there's a bit less of a pressure to make a masterpiece. Like, you're not painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, you're painting a page in a book or a piece in a series. And you're also doing it as a team. So I do really like the atmosphere, and it's why I like teaching workshops in manuscripts, is there's a bit less pressure. You're not creating a single giant painting, you're just making a piece of something. Yes, patron demons. We can all use a patron demon. Like, I'm sure there are more. I'm definitely sure that there is a, some kind of digital patron demon whose name has not been discovered yet. All right, so I am going to hop up here for a moment, check on this. Have just a few minutes left. And so I want to make sure that this poor lady gets a face before we finish. So I am going to hop in quickly with one of the microns and do the face that way. And the local art supply store talked me into getting this as a pencil box. I said, we found something for you. And he said, oh no, now I have to get it. It's fantastic. I love it. All right. So I can just about see the face right there. So I'm going to push down on all my tapes again. And this is the 0.1 micron, so it's going to be a bit thinner than other things. Thank you. I love my pencil box. So I'll usually go over everything a few times so that the thickness goes a bit better with the rest of the piece. Right, so there we have a nice old woman with her pet dragon. Yep, so the face is also on my graph paper. Tape will let me. So there she is, and there she is. I look at the work of Jamie Hernandez a lot, the fantastic comics artist who does incredible, incredible drawing. And the faces in his comics are tiny, but they're all very, very carefully done. So he's able to pack a lot of expression into just a few lines. Yeah, Jaime Hernandez. Going to give this guy some eyes too and some little horns so that they can at least make eye contact together. And yay, they are friends. Thank you, Anna Russell. Yay. Awesome. So very quickly, as the final thing, I'm going to take it off and sort of move it around so we get that shiny gold, because that is the most important thing. Right, so I'll continue working on this and make a post so that we get to see it all finished, all painted. Because I quite like this lady with her dragon friend. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming to see this. Hope you had a good time. I hope you have a fantastic convention. Let's see. Mini Fandom Geek Girl Joanne put my Instagram in the chat. My website is Hannah Charlton Arts, and I am selling prints, and I do have special flights of Foundry, special for free shipping. So please go check that out.